The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across marble floors as Victoria Chen stood frozen in the doorway watching her son Marcus accept a humanitarian award from the very people who had once thrown her out like garbage. 23 years later she was back in their world, but this time she held all the cards. Victoria's story began in the cramped back room of Golden Dragon restaurant where steam from endless pots of soup mingled with her mother's exhausted sighs. The restaurant occupied a narrow corner in Chinatown squeezed between a laundromat and a shop selling jade trinkets to tourists. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her parents Chen Wei and Lin Mei had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but determination and a family recipe for dumpling soup that customers lined up for every morning. The Chens worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. Victoria's childhood soundtrack was the sizzle of oil in woks, the rapid-fire Mandarin between her parents as they coordinated orders, and the constant ding of the cash register that never seemed to ring often enough. She did homework at corner tables, fell asleep to the sound of her parents cleaning the kitchen, and learned to fold wontons before she could properly hold a pencil. Money was always tight. Victoria wore the same 3 dresses to school, rotating them carefully so classmates wouldn't notice. Her backpack was a hand-me-down from a cousin in California, patched with duct tape where the zipper had broken. While other kids bought lunch, she carried containers of leftover rice and vegetables that marked her as different, as other, as less than. But Victoria was brilliant. Her teachers noticed first, the way she absorbed information like sunlight, how she solved math problems in her head while other students struggled with calculators. By high school she was valedictorian material, her grades a beacon of hope in a family drowning in debt and exhaustion. The scholarship to Columbia University felt like winning the lottery. Victoria's parents cried when the letter arrived, their calloused hands shaking as they held the paper that promised their daughter a future they had only dreamed of. The full ride covered tuition, room and board, but it didn't cover the invisible costs of belonging in a world designed for people with trust funds and summer homes. Columbia's campus in Manhattan might as well have been another planet. Victoria's dormmates casually mentioned spring break trips to Europe and internships arranged through family connections. They complained about dining hall food while she was grateful for 3 meals a day. Her clothes came from discount stores while theirs bore labels she couldn't pronounce but recognized as expensive. It was during her junior year that Victoria met David Worthington. She was working her campus job at the library, shelving books in the economics section, when she literally collided with him as he rounded a corner. Books scattered across the floor, and as they both bent to collect them, their hands touched over a copy of Principles of Macroeconomics. David was everything Columbia represented but that Victoria had only observed from the outside. Tall and confident, with the kind of easy charm that came from never doubting your place in the world. He wore casual clothes that probably cost more than her family's monthly rent, but he wore them without pretension, as if expensive was simply normal. What struck Victoria most was how he looked at her when she apologized for the collision. Not through her, not around her, but directly at her, as if she was worth seeing. When he smiled and said the accident was entirely his fault, she felt something shift inside her chest, a flutter of possibility she had never experienced before. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours. David had been researching international trade policies for a paper, and Victoria found herself sharing insights from her economics courses that impressed him genuinely. He listened as she talked about market dynamics and global supply chains, nodding thoughtfully and asking questions that showed he valued her intelligence. When he asked her to coffee the next day, Victoria spent 20 minutes staring at herself in her dorm room mirror, trying to decide if this was really happening. She owned exactly one dress nice enough for what might be considered a date, a simple navy blue sheath she had bought on clearance for job interview. Coffee turned into dinner, dinner turned into long walks around campus, and walks turned into study sessions where they challenged each other's ideas about economics, politics and the future. David was studying international business with plans to join his family's investment firm after graduation. He spoke casually about offices in London and Hong Kong, about deals worth millions of dollars, about a world where money was a tool rather than a constant worry. What Victoria didn't initially understand was the magnitude of the Worthington family fortune. They weren't just wealthy, they were generationally rich, the kind of family whose name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. David's great-grandfather had built a shipping empire in the early 1900s. His grandfather had expanded into real estate and banking. His father, David Worthington Jr., now controlled investments worth over $2 billion. The Worthington family lived in a world of private jets and exclusive clubs, charity galas and political influence. They summered in the Hamptons, wintered in Aspen, and treated international travel like most people treated trips to the grocery store. Their social circle included senators, CEOs and European nobility who had been family friends for generations. Victoria learned these details gradually, piece by piece, as David shared stories that seemed fantastical to someone who had grown up counting quarters for laundry. He mentioned them casually without boasting, because to him they were simply facts of life, rather than extraordinary luxuries. For 8 months they existed in the protective bubble of campus life. Victoria excelled in her courses while David coasted on natural intelligence and family connections. They studied together, attended campus events as a couple, and built what felt like a real relationship based on genuine affection and intellectual compatibility. But college relationships exist in artificial environments, and Victoria began to notice the careful boundaries David maintained. He never invited her to family events, never suggested meeting his parents when they visited campus, never included her in conversations about summer plans or post-graduation life. When she asked about these omissions, he had reasonable explanations that she wanted to believe. His parents were very traditional, he explained. They preferred to meet girlfriends only when relationships were serious. His family vacations were business-heavy and boring. His social obligations were tedious affairs she wouldn't enjoy. Each excuse felt logical in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of exclusion that Victoria tried not to notice. The invitation to the Worthington family's annual spring gala arrived during their senior year. David had been distant for weeks, returning her calls hours later, canceling dates with vague explanations about family obligations. When he finally asked her to accompany him to the gala, Victoria felt a surge of relief and excitement. This was it, the moment she would finally be introduced to his world as his girlfriend. David's nervousness should have warned her. He spent their preparation time offering suggestions about her appearance, her conversation topics, her behavior. He meant well, she told herself. He was helping her navigate unfamiliar social waters. When he gently suggested she might want to avoid mentioning her parents' restaurant or her scholarship, she agreed. When he coached her on which topics were appropriate for conversation with his parents' friends, she listened carefully and took mental notes. The gala was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Temple of Dender transformed into an elegant party space for 500 of New York's most influential people. Victoria had borrowed a dress from her roommate, a black evening gown that looked sophisticated but felt like a costume. She had practiced walking in borrowed heels, rehearsed small talk about safe topics, and memorized details about art and culture that might help her fit in. Walking into the museum on David's arm, Victoria felt like an actress playing a role she hadn't fully learned. The other guests moved through the space with inherited confidence, greeting each other with air kisses and insider jokes. The women wore jewelry that caught the light like captured stars, and the men discussed business deals and political appointments, as casually as others might talk about the weather. David's parents, Margaret and David Jr., held court near the Egyptian wing, surrounded by admirers and supplicants. Margaret Worthington was elegantly beautiful in the way that expensive maintenance and good genetics combined to create. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her cream-colored gown probably cost more than Victoria's family earned in 6 months, and her smile was practiced and precise. David Jr. was distinguished and commanding, the kind of man who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and his attention clearly valuable currency in this social ecosystem. When David finally introduced Victoria, she felt the subtle shift in atmosphere immediately. Margaret's smile became slightly more fixed, her handshake a fraction less warm. David Jr.'s questions were polite but probing, designed to extract information about her background, her family, her place in their social hierarchy. Victoria answered carefully, using the neutral phrases David had suggested. She described her parents as small business owners, her background as middle class, her plans as focused on international business. She avoided specifics about Chinatown, about working in the restaurant, about the scholarship that made her education possible. But Margaret Worthington had decades of experience reading between social lines, and she extracted the truth from Victoria's careful evasions like a surgeon removing a tumor. The questions became more pointed, the implications clearer. Where exactly was this restaurant? What sort of clientele did it serve? How interesting that Victoria had managed to attend Columbia despite such humble circumstances. The conversation was a masterclass in polite humiliation. Margaret never said anything directly insulting, but every question felt like a test Victoria was facing. When she mentioned her economics degree, Margaret smiled indulgently and commented on how ambitious young people could be, as if Victoria's academic achievements were charming but ultimately irrelevant. Other guests began to notice the interrogation. Victoria could feel eyes on her, could sense the whispered conversations happening just beyond her hearing. She was being evaluated, measured, and found wanting by people who had never doubted their own worth. David stood beside her throughout the ordeal, his jaw tight but his voice silent. When his mother made increasingly pointed comments about the importance of compatibility in relationships, about how different backgrounds could create insurmountable challenges, David simply nodded and asked if anyone needed more champagne. The final humiliation came when Margaret steered the conversation toward David's future. She mentioned several young women from appropriate families, describing their accomplishments and connections with obvious approval. The message was crystal clear: these were the kind of women worthy of a Worthington heir, and Victoria decidedly was not. When Victoria excused herself to the restroom, she wasn't seeking privacy to regroup, she was escaping before the tears she had been holding back could embarrass her further. In the museum's elegant bathroom, surrounded by marble and gold fixtures, she stared at her reflection and saw someone playing dress-up in a world where she would never belong. The woman looking back at her was an imposter, someone wearing borrowed clothes and a borrowed identity, trying to be something she fundamentally was not. For the first time in her life, Victoria felt ashamed of her parents, ashamed of their sacrifice, ashamed of the very strength and determination that had brought her this far. When she returned to the party, the conversation had moved on to David's summer internship plans and his post-graduation trajectory. Margaret was describing opportunities at prestigious firms, introductions that could be arranged, doors that could be opened through family connection. The future being mapped out for David had no space in it for someone like Victoria. The ride back to campus was suffocating in its silence. David gripped the steering wheel of his BMW like it was the only thing keeping him anchored, his knuckles white with tension. Victoria stared out the window at the city lights, each one seeming to mock her naivety. When they finally reached her dormitory, David walked her to the entrance but made no move to kiss her goodnight. Instead, he stood awkwardly in the fluorescent light of the building's lobby, his hands shoved deep in his expensive suit pockets. "They just need time," he said finally, his voice lacking any conviction. "My parents are protective, they want what's best for me, and they don't know you like I do." Victoria looked at him, this man she had thought she loved, and realized she was seeing him clearly for the first time. He wasn't defending her or fighting for their relationship, he was making excuses for his family's behavior while simultaneously accepting their verdict. "What do you think?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer from the way he couldn't meet her eyes. David was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of surrender. "I think they might have a point about compatibility. We want different things, come from different places. Maybe that matters more than I thought it would." That night Victoria cried until she had no tears left. But her grief wasn't just about losing David. It was about losing faith in herself, about allowing other people's judgment to make her question her own worth. For the first time in her ambitious, determined life, she wondered if they were right. Maybe she had been reaching too high, dreaming too big, thinking she could be something she wasn't meant to be. The breakup, when it came 2 weeks later, was almost anticlimactic. David had been avoiding her calls, canceling their usual study sessions, responding to her texts with increasingly distant politeness. When he finally asked to meet, they sat in the same campus coffee shop where they had had their first real conversation about their dreams and future. "My parents think we're too serious too fast," David said, using their words to avoid taking responsibility for his own choice. "They think I should focus on my career right now, not get distracted by relationships that might not lead anywhere." Victoria wanted to fight for them, wanted to argue that love should matter more than social approval. But looking at David's face, at the relief barely hidden behind his regret, she understood that the battle was already over. He had chosen his family's approval over their relationship, security over love, tradition over the possibility of something real. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. David nodded, finally meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry, Victoria."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"You're amazing, but we're from different worlds. In movies, that's romantic. In real life, it's just complicated." Walking back to her dorm after that conversation, Victoria felt like someone had reached inside her chest and removed something essential. The campus that had felt like home for 4 years suddenly seemed foreign and unwelcoming. Students she passed looked at her differently, or maybe she was seeing them differently, aware now of all the subtle markers of class and status she had been too naive to notice before. The remaining weeks of senior year passed in a haze of academic obligations and social situations that felt hollow. Victoria completed her coursework, attended graduation ceremonies, and prepared for her post-college life, but inside she felt fundamentally changed. The confident young woman who had believed intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle had been replaced by someone who questioned every assumption about her own worth. She had learned that some doors remained locked no matter how hard you knocked, that some worlds were designed to exclude people like her, and that love wasn't always enough to bridge the gaps between different lives. The lesson was devastating, but it was only the beginning of a journey that would ultimately teach her something far more valuable: that their rejection said nothing about her worth and everything about the limitations of their world. Victoria's transformation began in the most unexpected place, the unemployment office in downtown Manhattan. 6 months after graduation, armed with her Columbia economics degree, she had been rejected from every finance position she applied for. The prestigious firms that recruited her classmates somehow never had openings when she interviewed. Her resume, impressive on paper, seemed to carry invisible marks that disqualified her from the world she had studied to enter. Sitting in a plastic chair surrounded by other job seekers, Victoria felt the weight of her student loans and her parents' sacrifices pressing down on her shoulders. The Golden Dragon restaurant was struggling more than ever, and she had moved back into her childhood bedroom above the kitchen, listening to the same sounds of sizzling oil and tired conversations that had defined her youth. It was there, in that sterile government office, that she met Patricia Williams, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority. Patricia was volunteering as a career counselor, and when she sat down across from Victoria, something in her expression suggested she understood disappointment intimately. Columbia Economics, Patricia said, reviewing Victoria's file. Magna cum laude, excellent recommendations. So why are you here instead of working at Goldman Sachs? Victoria had rehearsed professional explanations about market conditions and competitive landscapes, but something about Patricia's directness cut through her prepared responses. Because they don't want people like me, she said simply. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying Victoria with the intensity of someone who recognized a familiar story. Let me tell you something about people like us, she said quietly. I have a PhD in biochemistry from Harvard. 20 years ago, I was exactly where you are now, being told I wasn't the right fit for positions I was overqualified for. You know what I learned? Victoria shook her head, drawn in despite herself. I learned that their rejection wasn't about my capabilities, it was about their limitation. So I stopped trying to fit into their world and started building my own. Patricia smiled, and there was steel beneath the warmth. I now run a pharmaceutical research company worth $300 million. Those same people who wouldn't hire me now compete for my business. Over the following months, Patricia became the mentor Victoria hadn't known she needed. She didn't just offer encouragement, she provided a roadmap. Patricia had identified a gap in the market for financial consulting services specifically designed for immigrant-owned small businesses, companies that traditional firms overlooked or overcharged. You understand their challenges because you live them, Patricia explained during one of their weekly coffee meetings. You speak their language, literally and figuratively. That's not a disadvantage in the finance world, that's a competitive advantage they're too blind to see. Victoria threw herself into building Chen financial consulting with the same intensity she had once applied to her studies. She started small, offering bookkeeping and tax preparation services to restaurant owners in Chinatown. Her first office was a corner of her parents' restaurant. Her first clients were family friends who trusted her because they trusted the Chen family name. The work was unglamorous but essential. Victoria helped Korean grocery store owners understand complex tax regulations, assisted Filipino entrepreneurs in securing small business loans, and guided Chinese restaurant families through the maze of health department requirements and licensing procedures. She worked 18-hour days, just as her parents had, but these were hours invested in building something of her own. Her breakthrough came when she helped the Nakamura family save their electronics store from bankruptcy. The previous accountant had mismanaged their books so badly that they owed 3 years of back taxes and were facing closure. Victoria spent weeks reconstructing their financial records, negotiating with the IRS, and restructuring their debt. When the store not only survived but began thriving under her financial guidance, word spread through the community like wildfire. Within 2 years, Chen Financial had grown beyond Victoria's wildest projections. She had 15 employees, offices in 3 boroughs, and a client list that included over 200 small businesses. Her reputation for combining financial expertise with cultural understanding made her the go-to consultant for immigrant entrepreneurs throughout New York City. The media attention started when a business journalist wrote a feature about Victoria's innovative approach to community-based financial services. The article described her as a financial translator, someone who could bridge the gap between complex American business regulations and the practical needs of immigrant entrepreneurs. Suddenly, Victoria was being invited to speak at conferences, serve on nonprofit boards, and participate in policy discussions about small business development. It was at one of these conferences that she met Thomas Chen, a successful venture capitalist who shared her surname but no family relation. Thomas had built his fortune by identifying undervalued companies and helping them scale to massive success. He approached Victoria after her panel discussion on community banking with genuine interest in her business model. What you've built is remarkable, Thomas said over dinner that evening, but I think you're thinking too small. The principles you're applying in New York could work nationally. Have you considered franchising your model? Thomas wasn't just offering business advice, he was offering partnership. He saw potential in Victoria's company that she hadn't yet imagined. possibilities for growth that could transform Chen Financial from a regional success story into a national brand. Over the following months, they worked together to develop expansion plans that would bring culturally competent financial services to immigrant communities across the country. The relationship that developed between them was built on mutual respect and shared vision rather than the unequal dynamic Victoria had experienced with David. Thomas valued her insights, challenged her ideas constructively, and never made her feel like she needed to be anyone other than exactly who she was. When their professional partnership evolved into something personal, it felt natural and right in ways that her college relationship never had. 3 years later, Victoria received an invitation that stopped her cold. The Worthington family was hosting their annual charity gala, this time to honor outstanding young entrepreneurs who were making a difference in their community. Victoria's name was on the list of honorees, and David Worthington Jr. himself had signed the invitation letter praising her exceptional contributions to small business development and community empowerment. The irony was almost too perfect to be believed. The same family that had dismissed her as unsuitable for their son, now wanted to celebrate her achievements and associate their charitable foundation with her success. Victoria's first instinct was to decline, to maintain the dignity of distance from people who had caused her so much pain. But Thomas convinced her otherwise. "You're not going back as the girl who wasn't good enough," he pointed out. "You're going as the woman who proved they were wrong about everything that mattered." The night of the gala, Victoria stood before her mirror in the penthouse apartment she now owned, looking at a reflection that bore little resemblance to the uncertain young woman who had once borrowed a dress to attend a Worthington. She wore a custom-designed gown in deep emerald green, jewelry she had purchased herself, and most importantly the confidence that came from knowing her own worth. Thomas waited in the living room, elegant in his tuxedo but more importantly, radiating the quiet pride of a man who loved her for exactly who she was. When he offered his arm, it wasn't as an escort helping her navigate foreign territory, but as an equal partner sharing in her moment of triumph. The gala was held at the same museum where Victoria had once felt so out of place, but walking through those familiar halls felt entirely different now. She moved through the space with inherited confidence of her own making, greeting other guests as someone who belonged there not because others had accepted her, but because she had claimed her place through her own achievements. Margaret and David Jr. approached her with smiles that seemed genuine until you looked closely enough to see the calculation behind them. They praised her success effusively, spoke about how they had always admired her determination, and carefully rewrote history to position themselves as early supporters of her potential. "We're so proud to honor you tonight," Margaret said, her voice warm with what might have been sincerity if Victoria hadn't known better. "You've accomplished exactly what we always knew you were capable of." Victoria accepted their congratulations graciously, but she could see through their performance to the uncomfortable truth beneath. They weren't celebrating her success, they were trying to associate themselves with it, to claim reflected glory from achievements they had once dismissed as impossible. David appeared at his parents' side, older now and carrying the soft edges of a life lived without particular challenge. His greeting was awkward, tinged with regret and what might have been embarrassment. He congratulated her on her success with the enthusiasm of someone trying to convince himself he felt happy for her. During the formal program, Victoria was called to the stage to accept her award and address the gathering. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience that included the very people who had once made her feel so small, she felt a profound sense of completion. "I want to thank the Worthington Foundation for this honor," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the museum's soaring spaces. "When I was younger, I thought success meant gaining acceptance from others. I've learned that real success means accepting yourself completely and building something meaningful from that foundation." She spoke about the immigrant entrepreneurs she served, about the dignity of small businesses built through sacrifice and determination, about the importance of seeing potential in places others overlook. She never mentioned her personal history with the family, never referenced her previous humiliation, but everyone who had been present years earlier understood the subtext. After the ceremony, David approached her privately, away from his parents and the other guests. They stood in the same Egyptian wing, where his mother had once systematically dismantled Victoria's confidence, but the power dynamic had shifted completely. "I owe you an apology," David said, his hands fidgeting with his bow tie. I let them convince me that what we had wasn't worth fighting for. Seeing what you've accomplished, knowing I was part of what hurt you, I realize I made the biggest mistake of my life." Victoria looked at him, this man who had once held such power over her happiness, and felt nothing but peaceful indifference. "You didn't make a mistake, David. You made a choice that revealed who you really were, and that choice forced me to discover who I really was. I'm grateful for both revelations." "Do you think," he started, then stopped, gathering courage. "Do you think we could try again? I'm different now, I wouldn't let them interfere." Victoria's smile was kind but final. "I'm sure you believe that, but I'm not the same person I was then.
I don't need anyone's permission to be worthy of love. I don't need anyone's approval to know my value, and I certainly don't need to prove anything to anyone who couldn't see it from the beginning. As the evening concluded, Victoria felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. Standing with Thomas as they prepared to leave, she looked around the museum one final time, taking in the elegant surroundings that had once intimidated her so completely. The Worthington family hadn't changed. They still valued surface over substance, connections over character, inherited worth over earned achievement. The only difference was that Victoria now met their superficial criteria for respect, but their approval no longer mattered to her. Walking out into the cool night air, Thomas's hand warm in hers, Victoria thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The rejection that had once devastated her had become the catalyst for discovering her own strength. The humiliation had taught her the difference between being accepted and being valued. The pain had shown her what she was truly capable of achieving. Margaret Worthington called after them as they reached the museum steps. "Victoria, you simply must come to our summer gathering in the Hamptons. We'd be delighted to have you." Victoria turned back with a polite smile that held no animosity but also no enthusiasm. "Thank you for the invitation, I'll check my schedule." But they both knew she would never attend, not because she couldn't face them, but because she no longer needed to. The girl who had once desperately wanted their approval had grown into a woman who understood that their acceptance was irrelevant to her worth. She had learned that belonging somewhere you have to shrink yourself to fit isn't belonging at all. Most importantly, she had discovered that the best revenge against those who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong, it's proving yourself right. As their car pulled away from the museum, Victoria settled back against the leather seats and smiled at Thomas, who understood her value instinctively and had never needed her to prove she was worthy of love. The girl who had once felt too small for their world had built a world of her own, one where merit mattered more than pedigree, where hard work created more value than inherited wealth, and where being true to yourself was the only approval that ultimately counted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.